Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI Government in the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanik. Today, we are joined by Alex Fink, a remarkable entrepreneur and thought leader in the AI industry. Alex is the founder and CEO of OtherWeb, a groundbreaking platform that leverages AI to enhance the quality of information consumed online. He's also co-founder of Swarmer, a company pioneering AI-based solutions for autonomous drone systems. With a rich background in technology innovation, Alex has hosted insightful conversations on the OtherWeb podcast, delving into the media landscape and the broader information ecosystem. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you. As a means of getting us started today, I was hoping that you could share with us some of your experiences that have shaped your current perspective on AI governance. What really got you into focusing on some of those computational aspects of those systems?
So I started from the camera side, computer vision, that sort of thing. And eventually I found myself in the news, which is a highly government adjacent market. And now I'm also partially involved in something that is used by militaries, especially in Ukraine right now. So I get a lot of exposure to this interplay between AI and government, some of it somewhat well-defined, some of it like military doctrines and the use of AI on the battlefield, completely undefined or completely outdated. So I have a lot of exposure to it. I wouldn't say that I can give you direct answers to everything because sometimes the answers just don't exist.
Of course. It's such is the fate of being on the cutting edge of something, right? Getting into our main discussion for the day, I'd really like to start kind of foundationally with the current landscape of AI-generated content and its rapid proliferation. I was hoping you could share your perspectives on how AI-generated content differs from human-created material, especially in terms of like creativity, originality, and potential impacts.
So it really depends on which modality you're talking about, but let's take text because this is what most people are aware of, that there's been this giant leap with large language models about 2 years ago. Essentially, the way these models have been trained is by giving them sentences with one word corrupted and getting them to learn how to guess the missing word. So they are really good at guessing the most likely word in a particular position. And if you ask them to write 1,000 words in a row, then they just guess the words one word at a time by giving you the most likely one in each position, which means the result is going to be somewhat bland because it is just the most likely average answer that you could get. It also means that the error will compound with the length of the reply. So by the time you get to the 1000th word, it is assuming the previous 999 are correct, but some of them weren't, right? And so the longer the answer is, the more you get of a drift of the answer from what the model actually knows to be true, which is itself based on stuff it read on the internet, which might not be true.
Does that shift with images and video, or do you see sort of a similar pattern emerging there?
Yeah, so images and video have not been trained this way because the method of corrupting a part of the input just doesn't work for them, right? Mostly because there's just too much data. So if you give a video as training input with one frame corrupted, you ask AI to guess the missing frame, it just cannot do that. Those methods do not work. So there are different problems that you see with video, but there's generally not the problem of guessing one thing at a time and therefore drifting. The problems you see with images and video is that AI models don't know physics, right? They're just trying to learn from patterns they've seen before, but sometimes that means you're going to see very unusual things. Like, I don't know if you saw the OpenAI kind of Sora demo videos, etc. There were examples there of like candles on a cake being blown out. Some of them are blowing in one direction, the other in the other direction, right? Because the model doesn't know that wind typically blows in the same direction across a cake.
As these models get better over time and the obvious mistakes start to become fewer and fewer, that I guess that's where the real impact is in terms of where does that help us land in terms of human generated content and versus the AI generated content? The creativity, the sort of IP implications. I think that's where I want to dig a little deeper in with these conversations. But just as a foundational setting, I mean, certainly there's some stuff with how the models are trained, but assuming that you find yourself in a situation where the text output or the video or image output is sufficiently sophisticated that it could trick most people. Are there other areas there then that you think have a big implication on human generated content?
Yeah, so let's separate again video and images from text because the problems there are completely different. So if you look at images and video, the fact that AI is able to create images and videos that trick us into thinking that they are real is a problem because you no longer can rely on images and video as evidence for anything, right? At that point, you just have to treat them as gossip. And the only thing you can rely on to know that something has actually happened is eyewitness testimony. Right, but the images and the video become unreliable. Now, you could fix that with chain of custody. There are a few standards that try to establish in the metadata of the file itself exactly where it was captured, by which camera, nobody tampered with it, or here are the list of changes that were done and here's what they included. That might fix a part of it, though still you're going to see a lot of fake images and videos go around online, or they will be printed on paper and then you can no longer look at the metadata. With text, I would say there's the opposite scenario here, which is I think that within less than a year, these models will be better at writing than humans. You already see this in small subsets of writing, like copywriting, where a properly tuned custom GPT is going to be a better copywriter than any human on earth at this point, or at least most of them. I think we're going to see this with journalistic content as well. And this will create two things, I think. The first one is that if today journalists are fact finders and writers, the writing function will become something they can no longer monetize because writing will become free and models will be better at it, right? So journalists will have to become essentially PIs, right? Because fact finding is the only thing they can do that models cannot do. The other problem, and this is the one that probably touches upon government having to step in at some point, is that if AI can paraphrase things endlessly and produce more and more articles on the same topic describing the same fact pattern, it means that copying from your neighbor is basically cost-free, right? You see somebody wrote an article about a particular event that occurred, you can generate an article that is just as good, doesn't plagiarize the original about that event. So being second and third and fourth and fifth is free. Being first is very expensive. So you're going to have a tragedy of the commons. Who wants to be first? Everybody's copying from their neighbor, but nobody writes original material unless they are either subsidized in some way or protected in some way. And so I think we're going to get that discussion very soon where either we're going to have to pay for investigative journalists the way we pay for basic science with grants or through university or something like that, right? Or we're going to have to give them the same protection that patent law gives to people who create basic science. And right now, copyright law only protects basically using the same verbiage, right? But it doesn't protect the idea or the facts that the article describes. So those are two discussions we're going to have. I don't know which way we're going to fall, but it's going to happen.
I definitely want to dig into some of the intellectual property issues. For our listeners, I'm hoping we can dig into some of the more foundational concepts so that conversation makes a bit more sense when we get to it, for those that are sort of using this podcast to help educate themselves. For the moment, I think getting into the sort of bias and misinformation risk that AI generated content presents. First question there, how prevalent do you think that this is? I mean, when we're consuming content from the internet these days, what percentage do you think is AI generated at this point?
It depends on what exact content you're talking about. So if you go to the New York Times, probably zero. If you go to a random result in your Google search results when you search for something, much more than zero. And if you go to websites that specifically exist for SEO purposes to basically sell backlinks or monetize traffic, then in some cases it's pretty close to 100%. There's an interesting personal story here, which is I used to be the VP engineering of a VR camera company called Aura. And at some point, I accidentally opened the website that used to be that company's websites, where I used to see our VR broadcasting camera. And I suddenly see there's 300 articles or so here, all written by the same person on the same day. And I go to one of the SEO marketplaces where you can buy a backlink, and I search for aura.co, which is the URL of that website. And I see that I can buy a backlink for $80. They would write an article, post it on aura.co, backlinking to whatever I want them to backlink to. So this happens a lot. These companies buy domains that used to be real, that used to stand for something, whether the company went bankrupt or a person just decided to retire and is no longer using that domain. That domain still has good reputation with Moz, with Ahrefs, with all of these services, right? And likely with Google. So they buy them up and they start using AI to generate a lot of content to post there. And then they start monetizing it through ads or by selling backlinks.
It's a very intense dynamic. We're seeing it at all sorts of different places, even in government consulting. That sort of stuff comes up now. And we have a lot of clientele that get very concerned around misinformation, that sort of thing. What sort of techniques have you seen that are out there trying to combat these kind of techniques that are having this rapid AI proliferation?
The first thing I would say is misinformation existed before AI. AI simply makes it worse in some sense. It makes content cheaper to create, all the way to zero potentially. So that is the risk there. But if you look already at the landscape, I see a lot of vague definitions of misinformation and things getting mixed together, right? There's the old concept of disinformation, which is information created to deceive on purpose, right? That has existed before. It exists now. It probably hasn't been increasing all that much over the past few decades. But now, because videos and audios can be faked, you're going to see maybe more persuasive disinformation. Perhaps not more of it, but it will be more persuasive. That's one risk of AI. Now, if you look at misinformation or malinformation, right? Misinformation being something that gives you something untrue, but not with the intent to deceive you, probably with the intent to monetize you, right? And malinformation being something that gives you something true, but partial, that leads you to the wrong conclusion, right? Those are kind of the more vaguely defined categories in the way most people talk about them. There, you're just going to see a much larger quantity because now it's cheaper to create. So why not flood the zone if you're monetizing things with ads anyway, right? If BuzzFeed used to hire journalists and tell them your quota is 15 articles per day, now that quota is going to be 500 or 1,000 for whatever replaces BuzzFeed, because BuzzFeed's out of the news business, right? And I see entire websites that are created to look like legitimate websites. If your listeners want to check one live, do nybreaking.com, like New York Breaking, right? And you will see a whole bunch of articles that are just scraped from MSN and other sources with a few word substitutions. And if you look at the about page, you will see it's created by an ad agency that is just monetizing the traffic. Right? And so there's a lot of these, but the stuff they are scraping might be false. And in that case, if they are rewarding it, they're just creating a higher volume of that falsehood.
So if you had the responsibility as a job of moderating content for a platform like this, and you were trying to minimize AI generated content, what sort of tools would you be looking at? What sort of techniques and tactics would you be using to do your best to try to at least provide transparency to say, this was AI content, this was written by a human being?
Okay, so it just so happens that I run a platform that actually curates and moderates content, and that's what we do. But I can tell you we're not focused on AI generated versus not AI generated as a primary parameter. I think the much better approach is to look at the content and try to figure out if it's good. Who created it is secondary, right? You see organizations like NewsGuard try to do this spreadsheet level filtering of saying this outlet is good, this outlet is bad. But what we see when we just plot the scores of every article coming from the same outlet is that there's a distribution within each outlet. And for some outlets, you see much more variance than for others, right? New York Times, most articles are roughly the same quality. But Washington Examiner, the news is great. The editorials are crap, right? And so you see much wider distribution of the quality of content. And when you add AI to the fore, then yes, you're going to get even more distribution potentially, more crap, but more great stuff. So why filter based on who created it when we could just look at the language itself and figure out this seems to use informative factual language, good references, always citing their sources, everything is laid out in a coherent manner, doesn't make any claims it cannot substantiate. That's a good article. Or you look at another article, this uses all adjectives, all adverbs, everything is superlative, no links to anything except your own article from yesterday. This is a bad article, right? And we can just do that and we ignore the source.
This maybe is a bit extreme then, but are there any sort of legal frameworks or legal concepts that would potentially try to step in like a regulatory capacity? I understand that that's your business model. But if you were doing something like election politics, you could understand a potential regulator stepping in and saying, no, we have to actually provide some sort of validation, transparency mechanism, something like that to give people peace of mind that what they're reading or viewing they can rely on. Have you encountered anything like that?
There's a lot of discussions about that happening, but as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union, I'm a little concerned about the idea that a government regulator is going to come in and say this is true and this is not true. Because ultimately, I grew up in a society where everything people believed was untrue because government said so. Right. And so I think that is the end state of regulators trying to determine what is true and what is untrue directly. Now, there's indirect approaches, which some might say are less concerning, some might say are more concerning, like that office the FBI had in San Francisco with 80 agents in it, basically sending takedown requests to social media for anything they considered misinformation. And that is also quite concerning. That's not direct government censorship, but to the extent that you want this to happen, you probably don't want FBI agents doing this, right? You probably want somebody hired based on a different set of criteria to do the job of takedown requests on social media. So what government can do is potentially help set the standards, right? And then let people do what they do. Government could also try to affect the incentives in some way. Because one of the biggest problems we have right now in the information ecosystem is that almost everything is monetized through ads. Ads pay per click or per view. There is no pay per quality or pay per truth. As long as that is the case, everything is going to drift towards clickbait. And if clickbait is also super cheap to create, you see where that leads, right? So government can think of ways to try to affect the incentives, maybe try to nudge ad networks towards, let's say, making the payout dependent on the content quality, right? So the same click on the same ad might pay more if the quality of the underlying page is high versus if it was low. Maybe that's a role for government to play. Maybe government can play a role in making sure that it's easier for consumers to switch from a bad platform to a good platform. Because right now, most platforms out there, the Facebooks, the Twitters of the world, they make it really hard to leave. You cannot take your data, you cannot take your connection graph with you, etc. So if government mandated something like interoperability between these systems, and if it mandated that you own your data as a user of those systems, right, then the moment a system becomes primarily misinforming, the way Facebook became in 2016, where we actually have stats that it had more shares of misinformation than shares of real information, right? At that point, people can punish that platform by leaving it, and maybe then it will have to correct its behavior because now there's a negative consequence to allowing the spread of too much misinformation on your system. Right? So that's a role that government can play without the heavy-handed thing that leads to what I've experienced in the first 6 years of my life.
Absolutely. And what I like about your perspective there is that it sort of sets that up as a spectrum. You know, on the one hand, you have total state control, bad censorship, all this stuff. And then the other side would just be like total free reign, absolutely no restrictions whatsoever. Those are sort of easy positions to understand. But as you get into these controls, you know, you're talking about either closing the distance between those two poles or finding somewhere on that spectrum where you sit. And then that introduces all of the complexity that you're talking about. And I think that's why it's so essential that we have these kind of conversations, because that's going to require very informed, very nuanced positioning in order to create incentives for maintaining innovation without squelching civil liberties in the process.
Yeah. I mean, let me give you a crazy example. Maybe this is too out there, but if I were a biologist and I wanted to design the perfect cow, there's no way that I could design anything that can actually survive in the wild, right? It's just an impossible task. But this is what the Soviet Union tried to do with the economy, with the news ecosystem, with all of these things. On the other hand, if I'm a farmer and I just want to selectively breed cows until a certain trait is maximized, well, that's something farmers have been doing for thousands of years, right? So there is a role for government, but it's more in the creating the selective pressure for evolution to proceed in the right direction than to step in and try to redesign the whole thing, because humans are terrible at designing complex systems.
That's a great example. So sort of extrapolating that one more layer, do you think that there's going to potentially be a role with AI assisted generation of legislation, and do you see any sort of potential concerns there?
Again, if there is a clear separation between content and the act of writing, then I think that role is entirely positive. So if the legislator, along with the aides, come up with the list of bullet points they want the legislation to cover, and then AI just writes a properly structured bill that actually thinks through all the corner cases and maybe asks the legislator, hey, there's this corner case you didn't cover in your bullet points. Would you like to clarify what you meant there? Right? Then that would be a positive use of AI. If it will be a draft me a legislation that gives me a good headline tomorrow morning in the local newspaper, that will be a bad use of AI. So I don't know which one we'll see more often. Right now, we mostly from the press hear examples of the latter, right, where somebody actually uses ChatGPT to write a legal brief, and it turns out to be really bad. I think in Arizona, we had an example of a lady that tried to craft AI legislation, and it asked AI to write it. So I hope we can avoid that. There's one other crazy idea I wanted to run by you. And again, I don't know how you would respond to this, but legislators themselves are supposed to be essentially an avatar of what most people in their district want, right? We have representative democracy. That legislator represents what a group of 800,000 people wants, for example. I can see a system design enabled by AI where I can create a very accurate avatar of myself. And so why should we only have 535 people representing us in two houses, right? When everyone can have their own avatar based on some open source code that we control, right? And then that avatar can have opinions on every single piece of legislation, which I don't have time to read, but that avatar will be able to read, right? In that case, I will be better represented, not by somebody who is just like an average of the opinions of 800,000 people. And that's in the best case, right? In the worst case, it's an average of the opinions of 400 donors. But in the best case, that representative represents the opinions of 800,000 people. Well, we could have AI representatives that represent one person, and that is me. All I have to do is input all my preferences and how I would vote given certain constraints. So maybe that is our future. Probably that's at least 50 years out, but it's at least possible in a world where AI exists.
It's one of the more interesting answers to a question I didn't ask you, but I have a feeling you might answer it the same way. I'd like to ask people in this age where we have these very intelligent but non-sentient algorithms that have been programmed on these large data models. I always like to ask, is a model like that sort of incompatible with democracy? Because whoever programmed that model exerts an enormous amount of control around influencing your thoughts and beliefs. And so now, are you voting for something that you actually believe, or are you voting for what you've been programmed to believe? And so that's the question, is like, does that create an incompatibility? But if you are doing what you said, where you have your own AI avatar trained up on your thoughts and beliefs, that might hold up a decent shield to that sort of lance that might be coming for you.
The risk still exists, because if my avatar is basically training data that came from me with a base model that was created by, let's say, OpenAI, do you trust the base model, right? But that concern also exists with the representative, right? He listened to my concerns, or she, right? Listened to my concerns. And now he or she is supposed to represent those concerns accurately in the votes on legislation that they're going to participate in. Do I trust that my concerns are what drives the decision making, or is it something else? And we have a lot of data to suggest that it's mostly something else, right? So the concern is the same in both cases. I would say AI has the advantage of possibly being open source, whereas humans cannot possibly be open source. But for them to be open source, we have to insist on it, to say that for a model to act as an avatar of a human, representing that human accurately in a democracy, that model has to be based on something open source that was audited by a large number of people. And we know there are no embedded biases. This is, by the way, what we do in our company. Whenever we have a model that evaluates the content of the quality of news, we always make it source available, right? Not open source because we don't want people to copy it and modify it, right? But source available so people can download it, test it, feed it inputs, see what it says, things like that. So if that is the base for our avatars, it would be better than humans are right now at representing us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are also notoriously bad at measuring risk. And so I'm contemplating in this situation where your avatar is prompting you all the time with, so these two beliefs are incompatible with each other. You are aware of that.
That's another thing that is potentially a benefit here, because we all have our higher selves, like what we want to do in the long run, versus our current urges, which is, I hate this guy, I want him to lose, for example, right? And so you can program your avatar not just to be you, but to be the best version of you when you're in a calm, collected, well-functioning state. Whereas normally you are, somebody stepped on my foot today, therefore I want everybody to lose, right?
Right, absolutely. It's a fascinating thought exercise that's closer to reality than I think a lot of people give it credit for. I think we've now given ourselves and our listeners enough of a foundation that I'd really like to dig into some of the intellectual property stuff that we had been talking about at the beginning of our discussion here. For our listeners, can you talk a little bit about how current copyright law addresses AI generated content? Because as you said, there's some problematic ways with its fundamental conception with how it squares against the technology.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is it doesn't, right? There is no mention of AI in all the legislation and case law that governs our use of AI, right? So what generally gets applied is normal copyright law along with what is considered fair use, right? Fair use is if you use a small portion of the content and you link back to the source and you don't hurt the business model of whoever wrote it in a substantial way, then typically you did not violate their copyright. Now, where exactly is the line drawn? Unfortunately, case law is very limited here. The biggest litigant on the side of the copyright holders in text was AP suing people for the most part. They are the only litigious party typically on that side of things. And they've only won cases where somebody stole entire articles verbatim, right? And so we as an aggregator actually act in the gray area of the law, you could say, where we think that because we only use the headline and all the summaries that we show are generated by us, and we link back to the source, and we can see that a good portion of our readers click the link and go to the source, we think what we're doing is fair use. Our lawyers think what we're doing is fair use. Nobody knows for sure, right? Because there is no case law. Now add AI to this, and you get to the point where now people don't just have to show a summary, right? They can just rewrite the entire article. In fact, we've been playing around with a model that takes 3 articles on a particular topic and merges them together to create one article that covers the topic well, but doesn't look too similar to any of the 3 original ones. Okay, so if you do this, you're definitely in the clear as far as copyright law is concerned. But you've just created a good article on this topic for $0, whereas those original 3 spent a lot of money creating it. So they have no chance to succeed in this market unless something gets changed. Either they get funded differently or they get some protection from us doing that.
So on that line then, do you think that AI generated works should be eligible for intellectual property protections?
AI as the copyright holder definitely makes no sense, right? Generally speaking, even companies can't hold a patent. Humans hold a patent, then they can assign it to a company, right? But so we always assume that the source of a work is the human that either created it or used something else to create it. We used to have a profession called computer, which are humans that sat at a desk and computed stuff with pen and paper. Then we created calculators for them. So now the computer could work faster with a calculator. Then we created a device called the computer that did a lot of what those computers used to do. And now we had a higher level profession called programmer, which used to program that computer in machine code, right? Then we created higher order programming languages that are not in machine code. They look a lot like English, but they can be compiled using something called a compiler to machine language. And now you had software engineers that would write software that looked a lot like human logic with some weird syntax rules, right? That was then compiled into something the computer could execute, right? So we keep adding layers and automating things away. And now we're adding this new layer called AI that can actually write software, right? I don't think that that changes things substantially. We can still treat AI from a legislation standpoint as just another iteration, one layer above the computer, but it's a tool that humans use. And so if a human files for a copyright on a particular image, I don't care which tools they use to create that image. The human created the image, unless there's some reason not to grant that copyright because, let's say, it looks similar to something others have done in the past.
That helps reassure me, because if you had come out and said, "Oh heck yeah, let's give them copyright law," I was okay. To who? To the output? To the system owner? To the programmer of the original base algorithm? Like, where would you even assign the right? And so I like the description that you gave, where it's like, let's just get back to basics and remember what we're really talking about here.
And by the way, I should mention that it's not just a question of copyright. You have similar questions in ownership, let's say. And even before AI, in the world of crypto, you already had distributed organizations that are supposed to manage themselves without humans, right? And I'm not sure legislation should allow that necessarily. At the end, you want humans whom you can sue or put in prison if they do something wrong, right? And so I'm not sure we want to go that right of giving something other than human ownership rights. Corporation is already kind of bad enough, and that we created this thing that has a corpus, right? It's treated like a person for legal purposes, but you actually can't punish them the way you can punish a person. And this is why corporations end up in many ways acting like a psychopathic person, right? This is also why we are registered as a public benefit corporation, because I don't want to be a C Corp, because C Corps turn psychopathic by design.
You're making me think back to my law school days in my business corporations class, and I remember becoming the class pariah when I said, "So B Corps wouldn't exist if we properly regulated C Corps, correct?" And that just created a hellstorm of a conversation in the class. But when you look at the way that we've regulated C Corps over time, we've meticulously pecked away at trying to break the chain between the corporation and its owners. And now that there's this, the owners exist in an ethereal way, and the corporation exists in a real way, but you can't put it in jail. All you can do is sort of fine it for dollars. And so that becomes a real problem, and has introduced huge moral hazard. So, I applaud your decision to become a B Corp.
Yeah, and by the way, in terms of you can only find them, well, no, in reality, you can basically pull their incorporation status, right? It's just that nobody does that, because then you lose tax dollars, and therefore it goes against the incentives of the people who end up in government. But in general, even within this idea that it has its own body, no humans involved, you can punish it much more severely than settle with them for $53 million or whatever Boeing just agreed to pay for killing a bunch of people, right?
Unless you start stacking the moral hazard on moral hazard on moral hazard, and then here we are. Yeah, absolutely. Getting back then into another legal concept here, with AI generated content and its interactions with freedom of speech. Where do you think we might be running risks there, and what sort of challenges do you see coming from that perspective? I mean, if we got the property rights, sort of, they are what they are, we now have this concept with freedom of speech that we're going to have to contend with. And I think that's highly relevant here.
Again, if you look at AI as just another layer of automation that helps people create more stuff or create stuff more easily, it doesn't actually affect freedom of speech in any way, right? The problems arise when you start giving AI powers that humans didn't have before. For instance, you have AI sometimes used to filter stuff. And then if a human did this, you would be able to sue them and say, hey, you were biased here. Let's say filtering resumes. I know this is not exactly a freedom of speech, but just as an example, right? If a human filters out all the resumes of Black people out of the pile, you can sue that human for doing something that is obviously illegal. But if an AI model does this and you ask, hey, why did all those Black people get filtered out? We don't know. It was the model. It just learned on things that have worked in the past, right? So AI ends up being immune from something that humans would not be immune from doing. We can have those examples in freedom of speech as well, where if the moderation on Twitter is done by an AI model and somehow magically a lot of different types of speech disappear, now you can't trace why that was done. If government then starts using AI, now that becomes a direct First Amendment problem because Congress shall make no law. So they will make a law that doesn't filter speech, but just creates models that will filter speech based on what? We don't know. So those are probably all the implications. As long as we always keep humans responsible at the end and we don't let AI do something that we wouldn't let a human do, I don't see a problem. Do you?
Well, so I think the human in the loop is really essential, as you say, and obviously a freedom of speech violation is a pretty narrow class of communications, because for every hateful, vile thing that one side says, if we're going to allow them to say that, we have to allow its counterpoint, the hateful, awful thing, to exist over there. It really comes down to like incitement and that sort of stuff. Um, the human in the loop is a very interesting way to combat this. It does require that to be the case. And then I guess my question would be if you did have a concern around a freedom of speech issue, who then do you hold responsible? You can't hold the algorithm responsible, really, because I mean, it's machine code. So does the human in the loop now start to bear culpability? Does the original prompter that created the questionable content in the first place, do they become the person that you start to care about? And so that's, my concerns here are that you don't want to have a governmental structure that, in trying to protect civil liberties, actually does more damage to them. Because like what you were saying, some of your examples around the way that information was treated in the Soviet era, that's exactly the sort of trajectory you could inadvertently find yourself on, where it's like, oh, we don't want to have freedom of speech problems with AI, so we better put on these regulations. But now you have the government controlling your speech.
Yeah, so I would say human in the loop might be overkill. Like, what you need is a human on the line, right? The human needs to be ultimately responsible in some way. And you mentioned the generation side. So you can think of freedom of speech as having both sides, right? First of all, if I create content, whether I use AI or not, you need to be able to sue me for libel if I actually defamed you, right? But if I'm in the government and I'm filtering content, whether or not I'm doing it with AI, you need to be able to sue me on First Amendment grounds and say I had no right to do that because I'm associated with the government and I overstepped my bounds because this wasn't incitement or one of those other forms of speech we are actually able to restrict. Right. So both of these need to be true. And as long as you treat AI as just a tool that somebody used, then that somebody can still be responsible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the sanest sort of middle ground that you're going to have. I mean, who knows? Some new innovation might come out and it changes this calculus for us. But I think for the moment, I mean, that's the sort of like level-headed way to look at it. That is the most protective to civil liberties without completely squashing innovation in the process. I do like to ask people that come on, put yourself into the shoes of a governmental policymaker, and you're looking to the future. If you could advise them in any way, shape, or form, what would you say they need to be aware of? What should they be really following closely so that they are able to stay current with this topic area?
Well, if you want to stay current, there's honestly nothing better than tinkering. I don't know if our legislators or people in government are going to do that, but you can't understand those tools unless you can poke at them a little bit, touch them, see what they feel like, right? If all you're doing is reading briefs of somebody else summarizing what ChatGPT has done, then chances are you don't understand ChatGPT. And the same goes for all the other tools. Now, as far as what I would advise them going forward, I would really try to focus on incentives. because that is the best way for people in government to try to shape where an industry ends up leading. And we've seen some really bad examples in the US, like the regulation of ISPs in the 90s, for example, which basically led to the number of ISPs going from 3,000 down to 6, right? And so you want to really watch what incentives you're creating for an industry, because this is probably an industry where you don't want to have too much centralization. You want the incentives to lead towards this thing being more democratized and more distributed. So that's one set of incentives to think about. You also want to create incentives for benign uses and not malicious uses. If you just try to regulate malicious uses, you will probably fail because you won't be able to think of all of them. But if you try to disincentivize them, then it might work.
Nice. I really like that perspective. Going after the incentives is a more lasting form, and it doesn't have the same sort of weaknesses that some of the other regulatory mechanisms do, because what can be written into law can be unwritten from the law. Whereas an incentive structure is much harder to combat because you have just more people and more livelihoods relying upon it. And so it has a little bit more staying power. And then it also lets the development and the markets have their influence.
I would add the other negative scenario of what you just said, which is that what gets written into law often gets stuck in the law even when it's badly outdated, right? I used to work in the camera world, right? And one of the odd things that you have to know as somebody who makes cameras for a living is there is a law against eavesdropping from 1973 that is still the reason why a lot of cameras can't have audio, because the moment they add audio, if it's not visibly a camera, you either have to have a red blinking light or you have to basically disable audio. Otherwise, you're in violation of that law. And so maybe it's correct, I don't know, but the idea that the law from 1973 governs how we make cameras today is just bizarre. But nobody had an incentive to rewrite that law. And so that seems to me like an example where if this wasn't a law, if this was just an incentive from the market not to make eavesdropping devices, we would have been better off.
To add some credibility to your statement there's a legal blog for law students called Above the Law, and they frequently run features on the sort of outdated law of the month. And they will find some law. Sometimes they go back to like Spanish land grant days in the 1500s that yet is still on the books. And they're crazy stuff. Goats have the right of way being herded down Main Street during these hours of the day, or, horribly outdated gender roles and stuff like that. So I think that there's a lot to what you're saying. So much so that specialists in the field have dedicated content sections to pointing them out for us. So yeah, absolutely.
And so much so that as a guy who designed cameras for the Beam teleconferencing robot, for example, we actually needed a sign off from the lawyers every time we redesigned where the red blinking LED is. Right? And so if the lawyers have to sign off on where you put the LED on a device that has two cameras and it looks like a robot, right? Obviously, nobody thought about it in 1973, that devices will look like robots. But this was clearly a robot that clearly can look at you and you can look at it. So the idea that we needed a specific size and specific position for the LED is crazy in itself. But the idea that we needed the lawyers to sign off whenever we moved it just shows you that law did not contribute to our ability to do things well.
Absolutely. Listen, Alex, this has been an awesome conversation. We're just about at our time, but I want to give you the opportunity for the last word of the day. Any things that you would like to share with our listeners before we sign off?
This has been relevant before AI, and it will be even more relevant now with AI coming to the fore. There's going to be a lot of bad information out there, and people have to really start paying attention to what they put into their brain, just like we've had a lot of bad food in supermarkets for a while now, and we're figuring out we have to pay attention to what we put in our mouths, right? So whatever tools you end up using, just make sure you use something and you have a strategy for how you look at it, because at some point, AI will just figure out what you like and will give you more and more of it, and you'll get unhealthy. So to avoid that, know yourself and have a strategy for how you choose what you consume.
Awesome advice. Alex, thank you so much. For our listeners, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Max.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.